This is the third video in this mini-series dealing with TitlePro's Light and Cam tab. In the last video I dealt with some of the parameters in detail, but I purposely left explaining the parameters for the three types of light source for this video. It can prove a bit tricky to get your brain around, but once mastered it opens up a whole range of new lighting effects that you can apply to your titles. Welcome to part 3 of tutorial 25. I'm using TitlePro 7 standalone again, and I've prepared a title so that I can demonstrate the light settings. I want to start by pointing out something I think I mentioned in part 1. Each title can have a maximum of 3 light sources, and each source can be one of 3 types. Something else to be aware of. When we're dealing with lighting, the title is referred to as a scene. In other words, lighting affects all the elements in the title, whether they be text, shape or image elements. You can see that my title has 2 elements. One is a text element and the other is an image that I've imported. To demonstrate the lighting, I want to rotate the text element. So I will select the text element and go to the Global tab. Now you can either do it with the rotation parameters or click on the globe icon and click and drag within the circle. You'll see that I've given the text extrusion to give it depth. Now go to the Scene tab and open up the Light and Cam tab. It's probably worthwhile again giving an overview of the 3 types of light sources available. We have directional, whose source is at a near infinite distance, a bit like the sun. It casts a constant beam of light across the scene. We then have spotlight. This can be used to illuminate a specific part of the scene, and the beam can be moved around. Thirdly, we have the point type. This type casts light in all directions, similar to a bare electric light bulb, and its source can be moved in 3 dimensions. Many interesting lighting effects can be created depending on where the source is placed. One final thing before we get into the detail. You'll notice that none of these light sources cast any shadows onto other elements in the scene, and is particularly noticeable when using the spotlight. This, I feel, is a great pity. It tends to remove the element of realism from the scene, but there we are, it is what it is. I want to deal with the directional light first, so I'm disabling lights 2 and 3. Now, as well as the directional sliders here, there is available a graphic over the top of the element that allows you to change parameters on screen. To enable this graphic, just click Light 1. I'll deal with this graphic shortly. Now this light is the one that shines from a long way away, so it only has 3 directional parameters, X, Y and Z. By the way, in England we pronounce Z as, well, Z. Other countries may pronounce it as Z. As I live in England, I'll continue to pronounce it Z. Anyway, these parameters control where the light source is located in 3D space. The X and Y parameters are the easy ones. These determine where, in 2D space, the light source is located. Imagine X is east, west, and Y is north, south. The Z parameter is the tricky one. The important thing to note about this parameter is that a negative value means that the source is behind the scene, and with a positive number, the source is in front of the scene. If the X and Y values are 0, in other words, the source is on the same horizontal plane as the scene, the Z values have no effect other than to illuminate the scene from either the back or the front. If the X and Y values are not 0, the Z values will affect the illumination in different ways. Now, if you refer to the control graphic, you'll notice that it has a number 1, signifying that it belongs to light 1. It also has a little sun icon, indicating the type of light. The part broken, part solid line points in the direction of the source and controls its position. The length of the line signifies the angle of the source with respect to the scene. I'll demonstrate how to use this control graphic in a short while. Now that's all a little weird to get your brain around, so let's play around with the parameters and see if a demonstration makes things more clear. Now if I make the X parameter 0 and the Y parameter 0, then change the Z parameter, you'll see that immediately the Z parameter goes negative. The scene darkens. That's because at that point the source is behind the element. Now that may sound a little confusing because I did say that the directional light source is at a near infinite distance. And that's the reason that that flips immediately. It goes from an infinite distance in front of the element to an infinite distance behind the element. A little counterintuitive that, but that's the way it works. The brightness control, of course, gives you control over the brightness of the source. It's important that you don't overdo the brightness, otherwise the element becomes washed out. You can also change the colour of the light. That's opened up on the other screen, so I'll pull that in. But doing so on a coloured element will affect the colour of the element in different ways. You can see that it also affects the background element. Just bring that back to 0, or to white should I say. Now we'll look at the graphic, the control graphic. Okay. To use this control graphic, you must click inside the circle. If you happen to click outside the circle at all, it switches you back to the Object tab. So you'll have to be careful about that. Always click inside the circle. Now you can see that the dotted line, the broken line and the solid line point to where the source is coming from. You can see the effect of that on the text, on the extruded text. You see there that the yellow line changed to grey. That indicates that the source is behind the text. It's gone grey, so you can't see the text. You'll notice that at some point the source is behind the text, but you can still see a bit of the text, and that all depends on the direction that the source is. Now I'll deal with the next type of light. I'll disable light 1 and enable light 2. Now this is the spotlight. We'll just ignore the graphic for now. If you look at the parameters, you'll immediately see that there are two sets of coordinates, position and direction. The position values determine where, in 3D space, the spotlight source is located. Again, a negative value of Z indicates that the source is behind the scene. The direction values determine where the spotlight beam shines. That description is a little too simplistic. It's true for the X and Y planes, but for the Z value it's a little more complicated. Think of it this way. With a negative value of Z, the beam will focus behind a scene, so the scene will be illuminated by the spotlight beam. Now, if the value of Z is positive, then the beam will focus in front of the scene, so the beam never reaches the scene, which remains in the dark. I know this sounds wrong, You'd think that even if the beam focuses in front of the scene would illuminate. But that's not the way it works in this instance. Think of the Z value being the end of the beam, rather than the focal point of the beam. I know that that doesn't happen in real life, but it may be better understood if it's thought of in that way. Got that? Right. Now let's look at the graphic. Again, the number refers to the light number, and you'll notice the little torch or flashlight icon, which identifies the light as a spotlight. The circle represents the spotlight beam width. This can be changed by hovering the mouse over the periphery until the pointer turns into a two-headed arrow. Then left click and drag either in or out. The cross is the centre of the beam, which can be moved by clicking and dragging. Now I'll just have to bring this down a little bit. Oops. Tricky to work this on this graphic. There we are. The triangle represents the position in 3D space of the spotlight source. This position can be changed by a left click anywhere in the circle, as I've just done, then drag. It has to be said that controlling the source in this way is much hit and miss, as you've just seen. Note that it's not possible to control the Z value of the position or direction coordinates using the graphic. As with the light one, wrong one. You can see that going negative, the triangle turns grey. Because the source is behind the element isn't illuminated. Now, one more point is that you can see that as I increase the Z value, the scene goes darker. That's simply because the source is further away from the element. So for a given brightness, the element goes darker. Just wind the brightness up, you can see that that lightens the scene. Just bring this down so the scene is brighter. And you can see that the beam width is similar to the circle. It's wider than the circle because the position value, Z value, is quite high. the closer I get to the element, the smaller the diameter of the beam goes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the direction parameter, Z parameter or Z parameter, must be negative for the scene to be illuminated. If I bring that down, or should I say up to 0, it immediately goes dark. That's because the beam ends before the element. Bring it back 0 and we get it illuminated again. And the reason that moved up there is because of this value here, position of the source. The interaction of all these parameters is very complicated. I'll now close this light down and disable it. We now come to light 3. This is the point type, and it's probably the simplest. As its name suggests, its source is a point of light. Think of it in terms of a bare light bulb, except that light is emitted from every part of the point. You'll see that it has only 3 position coordinates. This is because the point source can be placed anywhere in 3D space. Again, a negative Z value puts the point source behind the scene. This type of light is unique due to the fact that you can place the source anywhere, even between letters. It's a bit tricky to do this, but it can be done. The simplicity of this type of light is reflected in the control graphic. We have a number 3, the light number, and we have a little light bulb icon indicating the type, which is point. The triangle represents the location of the point source, with the solid dotted line indicating the direction and distance of the source from the scene. When the triangle is yellow, the source is in front of the scene. If it's grey, then it's behind the scene. The length of the dotted section of the line represents the relative distance the source is from the scene. The longer the dotted section, the nearer the source is to the scene. When the dotted section reaches the circle periphery, the point source is neither in front nor behind the scene. Just have a little play around with this just to show you how it affects the letters. And also the background. Just a further 4 things to mention. As I've said before, all 3 light types have a brightness control, and under certain circumstances it's important that this control isn't set too high. Too bright and the scene can look washed out. With type 2 and 3 lights, the brightness will be affected by the distance that the source is from the scene. As mentioned previously, the colour of each light type can be changed using the colour swatch. Finally, the parameters for each light can be keyframed. I think you'll probably agree with me, that's a lot to absorb, but the mechanisms will become clearer the more you work with them. As always, I hope that this series has been useful for you, and if it has, please consider subscribing. I also welcome any comments you may have. Until the next time, bye for now.